webinar by first introducing myself. My name is Maham Fayaz, and I am a lecturer here at Rifa Institute of Clinical and Professional Psychology. We were provided with this opportunity today to be talking about this very important topic, which is and as Dr. Fahad already put this on the screen, between the needs and desires, shifting the focus to treatment. Now, with that being the presentation that he will be talking about today, I would like to start by introducing Dr. Fahad to those of us who don't already know. Dr. Fahad Khan is a licensed clinical psychologist with a PhD in clinical psychology and is one of the leading experts in Islamic psychology. He is spiritually integrated and focuses on spiritually integrated psychotherapy, Nafs-based treatment models, and also serves as the deputy director at Khalil Center, which is the world's largest mainstream Islamic psychological treatment institute. He specializes in addiction, trauma, anxiety, depression, and identity struggles, and integrates Quranic cognitive restructuring, Tazkiya al-Nafs principles, classic Islamic scholarship, and evidence-based therapies such as CBT, DBT, ACT, and trauma-focused modalities. He is known widely for his work in Islamic psychotherapeutic frameworks. Us at Rifa Islamic International University place a focus on tarbiyah, ethical character, and integrating Islamic principles with modern psychology, which I think aligns directly with this nafs-based addiction treatment that you will be talking about. Not only does it value self-discipline and spiritual growth, but it's also this compassionate care support, which serves as a holistic recovery model that heals both the mind and the soul. So instead of looking at that independently, we look at that in a conjunction. Under the committed leadership of our head of department, Dr. Ruj Arshad, who is known for her clarity and strong focus on Islamic integrated clinical training, the department continues to create an environment where students and clients feel both supported and understood. And today's topic is for that exactly, so that we're able to provide more clarity between how modern psychology integrates with Islamic psychology. So without any further ado, Dr. Fahad, if you would like to please start your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala, wa tu'izzu man tasha wa tudhillu man tasha biyadika al-khayr. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خير to those who have organized.
Dr. Fahad, you're not audible.
Yes.
Could you please check your mic?
1 second. Okay, how is this? Is that better? No? Any no? It's
Sorry, Dr. Fahad, we're still not able to hear you. Could there be some problem with the connection or the mic?
no, but let me come back in again. Is it working now? Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Fahad, we can hear you now.
Okay. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Jazakumullah khair to those who have organized and given me the honor in presenting. Just to kind of start off, I think a lot of times the term Islamic psychology is is used, and I think it's used very freely. And a lot of times, I think the individuals who use the term may or may not understand that how the term ought to be used. Now, I'm not claiming that I'm an expert in Islamic psychology or I know how the term should be used. But there is a sort of inherent tension that exists when you use the word Islamic psychology. Islamic psychology, when I say Islamic psychology, it means, I mean, there in my mind, there it creates this type of polarity and dichotomy that there must also be a non-Islamic psychology or a Ghaffir psychology. And in reality, there's no such thing as Ghaffir psychology. So I just wanted to start off with that. Um, and one of the things, so to just clarify that point, um, I like to use the term Islamic psychology as a placeholder term for now, because I think at this point in time, where the world is dominated with the ideas that developed in the last 200 years, perhaps maybe 100, 150, 200 years. And that's what has shaped the field of psychology in the modern world. So, from that perspective, if we're trying to identify from our tradition, from the Islamic tradition, how psychology can be conceptualized and utilized, the term Islamic psychology is a good term to use. But I want people to really understand this, and I make it a point to explain this in the beginning of my presentations, is that 99% of what exists in psychology is actually Islamic. Now, the person who was introducing me, she said some things like practice DBT or ACT. I've been trained in all of these modules, and all of these orientations. However, I don't like to say I'm a practitioner of DBT. The reason is because I feel that the current models, they really pigeonhole you, and they really narrow our mind and our focus into one area and one aspect. If you look at the different theories and various theories and how they came into existence and how they became popular, all of them have some underlying assumptions. All of them have some primary focus, primary area that they target. For example, emotion-focused therapy, just like the name suggests, focuses on emotions. CBT primarily focuses on cognitions, on thoughts. A behavioral approach will focus primarily on changing the behavior, right, through reinforcements, punishments, classical or operant conditioning practices. Me, as someone who thinks and hopes that I'm practicing Islamic psychology, I don't like to narrow my focus into any one of those areas. A human being is a very complex creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this creation cannot just be understood, cannot just be conceptualized with one single approach. And not to mention, let's say if you took two twins, right, those who have exact same genetic makeup, they grew up in the same exact environment, and both of them are struggling with depression, for example, and you apply a treatment to them, you apply the 8 session 8 module CBT treatment to treat depression, you will see that both of them will respond differently, right? So no single treatment can be utilized to all individuals, and you have to have the flexibility to modify. Okay, with that being said, so why are we talking about the nafs? Because when someone asks me the question, what differentiates Islamic psychology? What makes it unique? What makes it special? I mean, for us Muslims, the fact that it's Islamic, or we call it Islamic, that in itself makes it special. But in the Western psychology, for example, we know they don't talk about the soul. I mean, maybe Christian psychology, some religious, if they do, it's more in the context of spirituality, right? And that spirituality is not really grounded. It lacks religion. And I don't think a true spirituality can exist without religion. It's you can claim, I mean, you can say that, oh, I'm a spiritual person, but at the end of the day, Your meaning and your purpose is only tied to your existence that is within the realm of this world, or within the realm of world of sense perception, or this physical domain that you can see and feel. Um, so we know that modern psychology lacks spirituality. The other area where modern psychology doesn't focus much on is the nafs. And the reason the modern psychology doesn't do it, in my opinion, I'm sure there are other reasons as well, is because of the force and the influence of materialism. The Western world, where psychology has flourished in the last century, is dominated by the idea of materialism. Is dominated by it has been hijacked and has been influenced heavily by postmodern ideas. So some of those ideas, for example, the idea or the age of post-truth, the a a time where subjectivity is given a lot of importance. So what you feel is what your truth is. And if you feel a certain way, then that's how you need to move forward with. And there's no objective reality, there's no objective truth that you can use to challenge your subjective truth. And if something makes you happy, then it is okay to engage in it, just as long as you don't, create any big problems. So if you like to gamble, gamble, but as long as you don't, lose a lot of money and you don't go into your retirement savings, right? Which, by the way, is another problem, like retirement savings and the whole idea and how that feeds into capitalism. You can drink alcohol, but just as long as you don't get drunk and break the law or drive. You can't drink and drive, but you can drink. As long as someone else drives you, it's okay, right? You can engage in sexual intimacy just as long as, actually, I wouldn't even say that now. Maybe 50 years ago, the idea was just as long as you're not married and you're not engaging outside of the course of marriage. Now, even that's okay, right? The movement of consensual non-monogamy and open marriages has become very popular in the West, and even amongst Muslims, right? Because the idea that if it makes you happy, if you're not happy with your husband or wife and you'd like to be intimate with someone else, then if that makes you happy, then you do it. So obviously, in a system like that, there will not be, we won't find any challenges to the nafs. Right, one second. We're not going to find any challenges to the idea of nafs. And I want to really talk about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about, from the perspective of science and psychology, why we have to shift the focus from needs to desires. Even from the idea of needs, there's some problem there, but we'll talk about that. And then we'll go into the Islamic concept of nafs and why I feel that all of us as psychologists, current or future psychologists, need to bring nafs into the conversation, into the picture, no matter who we're treating. Whether you're working with couples who are married and they're coming in for marital counseling, or you're working with children, or you're working with adults, someone who has depression, someone who has anxiety, someone who has OCD. Nafs plays a very central role in almost all of these illnesses, and we have to keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, so just to start us off, what is a desire? Now, desire can refer to all sorts of wishes and wants, but the more narrow definition of appetitive desire would be those motivations that propel us to approach certain stimuli in our environment and engage in activities with them that provide us with a relative gain in immediate pleasure, including relief from discomfort. Okay, so it's a very direct source. It's a very direct use of energy to engage with certain thing very specific in our environment, because we are either going through some pain and need some relief, or we are in a maybe homeostatic state, but we want some more dopamine, for the lack of better words, right? Now, obviously, desires are part of our physiological need states as well. So, food, when you're hungry, right, we desire. You can say we need food. Alcohol, people engage in that when they have some tension, when they're stressed. In America, for example, sex is it also a desired activity. Rest is desired activity. These are some of the examples. But it can also happen as a through a pattern of reinforcement learning. We can habituate into certain practices, and those practices then become part of our desires and our needs. So a good example is like a drug addict, right? So someone who takes heroin, someone who takes cocaine, who might use methamphetamine or ice, they are so habituated that physically they need that substance because their body has now grown dependence on it. On the other hand, substances that are not addictive, for example, like LSD or psilocybin mushrooms, even they become addictive because what the person desires, they're physically they may not desire the substance, but psychologically, their state of mind, they're so used to and they found so much comfort and benefit in that they want it again and again and again. Some people have addiction of spending. Some people engage in constant spending money, shopping sprees, and there are other examples of this as well. And so then we have addiction that stems from this circular pattern, right? This idea of like you have some pain and struggle, and you find your life boring, and that in itself is discomfort, and then you want to engage in something that's pleasurable, and this through reinforcement again and again and again turns into some sort of an addiction. So broadly speaking, it's the continued and compulsive use or a consumption of a substance or a behavior, like gambling, gaming, for example, despite its harm to self and others. Now, there's a key word there. This is the technical definition of addiction. At the end, it says, despite its harm to self and others. So the idea is, if it's not harmful to yourself or others, then it wouldn't be considered addiction. If the practice is done maybe once, in a while, like you go and gamble maybe once a month, or you go and, engage in illicit sexual activity, every now and then it's okay because you're not harming yourself, you're not harming others. That's where the problem exists, because we know most people. Now, I worked when I was after college. I spent some years working at a rehab clinic where we had alcoholics who would come and they would be treated for their alcoholism. And all of those who were alcoholics, now, in order to be an alcoholic or qualified as an alcoholic, you would have an addiction, you would have a dependence on alcohol. But all of them unanimously would tell you that when I took my first sip, my first drink, I never thought I would be here. Never thought I would be the one. I used to see people who would have addiction. I would choose to see people who were alcoholics, but I never thought that I would be one of those individuals. So the idea that when you start the process, when you engage in something that we know is unhealthy, that we know from the perspective of our Creator, what He has told us is not good for us, that from the get-go, from the beginning, it's wrong. It's something that needs to be stopped. It's something that we need to stay away from, right? In the Quran, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, right? Don't even go near zina, right? In الخمر والميسر والأنصاب والأزلام رجس من عمل الشيطان فاجتنبوه. Like drinking and gambling, and these are acts from shaitan, so stay away from them, right? So the idea is not that maybe engage with it a little bit, or unless, if you're not harming someone else, right, then it's okay. No, the idea is stay away from it. Why? Because it goes into the faculty of feeding your nafs. It goes into this aspect of our psyche that is very dangerous, that's very harmful. And if it's left to itself, then it would create more problems for us, not only in this world, but definitely in the akhirah as well. So obviously, in the Western psychology, they try to distinguish. They try to say, no, there's something called needs and there's something called desires, right? Needs are different than desires. Needs are okay, but desires is where it could be problematic. Now, these are some quotes that I have here from this paper. It's very beautiful quotes, and I wanted to read them just the way that they were presenting the paper. It says, we burn and are aflame with desires. We are pierced by or riddled with desires. We are sick or ache with desires. We are tortured, tormented, and racked by desire. We are possessed, seized, ravished, and overcome by desire. Some of this terminology you can probably even, recognize, right? People who, like drug addicts, they sometimes act like they're possessed. Little children, right, when they really want something, when they go into this temper tantrum state, and sometimes they lose themselves. It's almost like they're possessed by something, right? If you didn't know any better, you might think that they have some kind of jinn inside them because of how much they want something, and they will do whatever it takes to get it. We are mad, crazy, insane, giddy, blinded, or delirious with desires. We are enraptured, enchanted, suffused, and enveloped by desires. Our desires is fierce, hot, intense, passionate, incandescent, and irresistible. And we pine, languish, waste away, or die of unfulfilled desire. Now, try substituting need or want in any of these metaphors, and the distinction becomes immediately apparent. Because, from the perspective of the Western psychology, needs are anticipated, controlled, denied, postponed, prioritized, planned for, addressed, satisfied, fulfilled, and gratified through logical instrumental processes. Now, what they're talking about here is the use of our aql, right, to be able to control our desires. The difference between need and desire is a very thin line. It's a very fine line, and sometimes it's very easily blurred, right? So I'll give you a really good example. Food is our basic need. Okay, now if you're hungry and you need food to survive, you can eat a piece of bread, right? You can eat, some kind of a fruit, right? It's sufficient. It doesn't have to be tasty, right? As long as it provides your body with sufficient nutrients for the time being, you will live. You will have the energy to, move on about your day. Now, some people might say, okay, well, maybe we could have a proper meal. So what does that entail? Well, okay, fine. We'll have some, dal roti, right? We'll have some sabzi or something, some vegetables at home. But then some people say, well, I want a little bit more with that, right? So they might add something on top of that. They might say, okay, I want to have some chicken or some, lamb or whatever. So at which point in that continuum, going from being able to just eat a piece of bread to now having a chicken, beef, and all sorts of different dishes, at which point did it move from need to desire? That question can't be answered. It's very difficult to answer, and that's the point I'm trying to make. Because there's an assumption in the Western psychological models, that needs are okay because needs is something that you need. But desires are problematic because desires are going to then take you into a wrong direction. The point I'm trying to make is, whether it's needs or desires, your nafs is still activated. Your nafs is the primary force or primary energy that is making you want to engage in that behavior. So how do we know it's healthy versus unhealthy, right? And that is why I'm bringing this into the conversation. Let me finish this off. So he says, desires, on the other hand, are overpowering, something we give into, something that takes control of us and totally dominates our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Desire awakens, seizes, teases, titillates, and arouses. We battle, resist, and struggle with, or succumb, surrender to, and indulge in our desires, or indulge our desires. Okay, so how does desire influence behavior? Right. So in an automatic fashion, as reward. Hold on, let me pull up my own notes. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so desires emerge in a very automatic fashion, right? Obviously, it's something that starts off with as a need, and then if you've gotten used to it, it becomes part of that cyclical like pattern. And so there are parts of our brain that are considered reward processing centers in our brain, in the midbrain region, like the ventral striatum, for example. It'll evaluate external stimuli or mental images. So, for example, if you're hungry, you might start to think of food, or you smell food, or you see food, for example. And it does that against the backdrop of internal need states, and the person's learning history, right? So what they have done in the past, how they have engaged in it. This early reward processing may have the potential to trigger fast, impulsive, and habitual responses. So some people, as soon as they have a need, they or desire, they engage in it. As soon as they're triggered, they engage in whatever it is that they are desiring and that they want. And sometimes it happens outside of the conscious awareness, which is very interesting. Like you're not even aware of the fact that you are engaging in this process, that you are headed towards that direction. This is why it's important as Muslims for us to have constant awareness. When we talk about taqwa, what does taqwa mean? Being constantly aware that what I'm doing right now, what I'm engaging in right now, where is this leading me towards? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? Where's my nafs at right now? How am I in this current state, and which direction am I headed towards? Am I headed towards something that's unhealthy, or am I headed towards something that is healthy and humbling? These impulsive responses are most relevant in situations where the desired stimulus is already quite close in space and time. It's accessible to us. However, the more typical route is that the desire gains access to consciousness and deeply affects our thinking and our planning. Um, as it is spelled out by the elaborated intrusion theory of desire, which is one of the theories of desires by, I think, Kavanaugh or whatever his name is, desire related processing can be subject to a vicious circle of reprocessing and rumination that in itself does what? It increases the feeling of wanting, the motivational power of desire, right? That in itself wants and engages in more and more motivation towards the desire. As a desire becomes more cognitively elaborated in the working memory, you start thinking more and more of it. More of these ideas, images come to mind after the initial trigger. So does the potential to instigate concrete action plans and behavioral intentions to consume the object of desire. In our model of TIIP, traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy, we translated nafs as behavioral inclinations because um, pretty much all of the nafsani processes translate into some sort of behavioral inclination or a behavior. If it doesn't engage in behavior, you're inclined towards engaging in some sort of behavior. And as Muslims, we know that our behavior is ultimately what counts as against us. You may have the urge, you may have a thought. The thought and urge doesn't matter. It matters to the extent that it might lead you towards the behavior, but thought in itself is not considered sinful. Behavior is considered, the action is considered sinful. Okay, to continue, most important, elaborated desires may even predispose the individual towards sometimes, but oftentimes, problematic consumption. And this happens through two mechanisms. First, elaborated desires may crowd out, they may temporarily suspend or deactivate other representations from working memory. So, if, for example, I know that eating sugar is bad for me. Maybe I have a high blood glucose, and my doctor has told me that, hey, listen, if you eat more sugar, it's going to hurt you. You might die from it, right? It's going to cause a lot of problems for you. You might, have some of your organs might stop functioning. So if I see something sweet and I've been used to, and this cycle has kind of made me addicted to the behavior, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about that sweet. I'm thinking about that cake, that ice cream, whatever it is. That's shutting down and that's overcoming the other representation, which would be my doctor or my fear that I don't want to die. I don't want my organs to shut down. I don't want, my kidneys to have problems, right? So that shutting down of that leads to a preoccupation with the desired state at the expense of everything else, including self-regulatory goals and values. Secondly, elaborated desires, those that are not pushed away, will instigate processes of motivated reasoning that license and justify the indulgence, right? So people, for example, who are on a diet, they'll see something delicious and they're like, oh, I really want to eat that. What will this say? You know what? It's my cheat day. I deserve this. I've been good for like the last 5 days, so I deserve to have this. So the nafs ends up influencing the aql, right? The nafs will push the aql to justify its own needs, its own behaviors at the expense of the damage that happens to the individual, right? Or sometimes people say like, this is the last time I'm doing it. This is the last, cigarette that I will do before I quit. I'm quitting anyway. This is the last one I'm doing it. And if the problem is, or if the issue is problematic desires can also hijack the very mechanisms that otherwise support reasoned action, and it results in passionate behavior that oftentimes people later regret. Okay. Most people that engage in these behaviors, immediately afterwards they have a state of regression. They have this state of like, oh man, I should not have engaged in this. This is not something that I should have done because it was unhealthy for me. Okay, so what makes desires harmful? Well, I mean, desires can hijack the very mechanisms, right? So it hijacks our reasoning. It results in a passionate behavior, which oftentimes people will regret. Okay. And then, even though desires are straightforwardly connected to what promises immediate pleasure or relief from discomfort, its behavioral outcomes, behavioral inclinations, or behavioral end result are at odds with what's regarded as optimal, proper, and even moral. Right? A lot of times, in order to, like, look at the drug addict, right? A drug addict will steal money, will engage in theft, will harm their relationships, will hurt people in order to get what the drug addict wants, right? So there's a moral aspect to it that is also problematic. So according to like the moral foundations theory, morality, I mean, it's like I'm reading from Western psychological perspectives here, right? Morality is based on core moral principles. For example, care, like I don't want to harm other people. Fairness, I don't want to pursue my own advantage in ways that are unfair. Loyalty, right? I don't want to betray, my spouse. I don't want to betray my family, my people. Authority, like I don't want to break the laws, right? And then sanctity, also something that is indecent, something that's impure. And honesty, like I don't want to manipulate the truth. Each of these principles, to various degrees, can be violated by the enactment of a given desire. So, for example, a typical case of adultery, which is brought upon a strong sexual desire, it will result in harm, right? Which is related to obviously your commitment to your marriage. Degradation, it's something that's impure. Dishonesty, because people who engage in it will lie. People may be motivated to regulate their desires to the extent that they endorse these moral principles. Anticipate their desires' enactment will violate them. Okay, number three, enacting innate desires like food, water, sex, sleep, acquired desires like alcohol, cigarettes, and others that are, more or less harmful, drugs, for example, are typically a source of short-term pleasure and happiness, right? And this is where the cycle happens, unfortunately. So there's an anticipation process, there's consummation, there's disappointment, and a renewed desire for another object. In fact, most people, for example, pornography addiction is a good example here. Most people who engage in pornography, they have these images, thoughts, some triggers, and then they end up engaging in the behavior, suppressing their emotions of healthy shame, suppressing any kind of thoughts that might come to their mind of not engaging with it. But right after the process, right after engagement with pornography or even masturbation, they have this state of regret, right? Disappointment, like I should not have done that. And sometimes that state, because it gives them a feeling of sadness, a regret, sorrow, depression, grief, in order to overcome that state, they go back to the same process. They go back to, because they feel kind of down, right? Even physiologically speaking, there's a really good book. It's by Anna Lemke. It's called Dopamine Nation. in that she talks about the idea of how in our brains there's a balance, right? So if you engage in too much pleasure seeking behaviors, the brain has to counterbalance it by engaging in some like sad or the opposite of pleasure, right? Sometimes painful behaviors. And that process for some people, even though it's balancing the system, they don't like it. I mean, obviously, who likes pain, right? Naturally, we don't like it. So when the brain starts to go towards that pain seeking area to balance that pleasure, they engage in more pleasure because they don't want to be in that state. So that's where the vicious cycle will continue. So, for example, consider someone who's an alcoholic. They're married. They're fully aware of the fact that that giving in to their desire for another, sip of alcohol at the party will likely impair this person's ability to drive home safely. It'll put other people in danger. It'll make this person more, flirtatious with other people. It will put his marriage in jeopardy. So poor desire regulation not only involves personal costs, but also costs to other people as well. And last point, problematic desires may imply what's called intrapsychological conflict between motives. Right? There's a literal struggle between two souls within oneself. This is interesting because this is the Western psychology talking, right? And if you look at our Islamic psychology, we have similar kind of conceptualization here as well. Whether you look at it from a Rouhani perspective, like Shah Waliullah Dehlvi talks about the idea of two forces inside of you. One is that is animalistic, one is that is angelic, and they're at constant struggle with one another. Or even if we look at the idea of nafsul amara or nafsul lawama, right? Nafsul lawama constantly pushes back the behaviors of nafsul amara in order to prevent them. So according to this model, one part wants something and pushes for action, but the other part urges caution and voices good reason for why one should not engage in that behavior. This conflict has been shown to be aversive, unpleasant, affective experience. Now, I want to just put a little note there. This is again from the Western perspective here. Even though this is an aversive, unpleasant, affective experience, it's a necessary experience, right? Because imagine if you were someone who engages in something bad, let's say if you're married and your spouse tells you, hey, you shouldn't do that, right? And you're like, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't do that. And so you do it again, and then she tells you again, and you have this kind of back and forth, right? She's telling you to be good, and you keep doing something bad. If you shut her down, then there's nothing that stops you, right? What keeps you away from this behavior, what has the potential of keeping you away, is that this person constantly stops you. They constantly come in and tells you no. So this intrapsychic tension is actually a good and a healthy tension. Someone by the name of Gould, he specified that a consumption sequence in which a object desire arises, for example, you might get money to fulfill it, and an object is acquired and consumed, and after consumption, bliss then brings the death of desire, leads to the rebirth of desire, and then focuses on a new object. This specifies that the reproduction of desire itself is desirable, right? Like people sometimes get so caught up in that cycle that they actually want to continue with that cycle. That cycle in itself becomes desirable. Human beings, I mean, obviously part of our existence, as even Islamic psychology would tell you, that it has animalistic nature to us, right? We live in this dunya, we have to survive. The certain behaviors that animals have, we have them as well. I have a little kitten who's almost 4 months old. And the kitten, every morning when I wake up and the kitten comes to me and starts crying, starts meowing in a crying voice. Why? Because the kitten wants food, right? Similarly, I have a 10-year-old. When a 10-year-old is hungry, wants something, will come to me and start asking me, I really want food. Can you please make me food? It's a very similar behavior because part of our existence as humans is animalistic. And so this process, we get habituated to it. We want to engage with it again and again and again because it becomes in itself desirable. Okay. As Freud said, an unrestricted satisfaction of every need presents itself as the most enticing method of conducting one's life, but it means putting enjoyment before caution, and soon it brings its own punishment. Okay, so what are the consequences? Let's look at some data. All right, 1 second. I'll put my own notes. Okay, 40% of the deaths in the United States each year have been estimated to be attributed to behaviors that directly or indirectly have to do with poor desire control, like unhealthy foods, tobacco, alcohol, unprotected sex, aggression urges, illicit drugs. The unrestrained enactment of desire can be either be self-harming or interfere with the well-being of other individuals, or both. Lack of restraint can become an impulse control disorder, which results in compulsive consumption. Right? We talked about compulsive behaviors. More likely to engage in risky activities like gambling or credit overuse that can undermine their financial and emotional security. Right? People who have gambling addiction, for example, they engage in so much gambling that they don't have any money. They end up selling, their own property, or the jewelry of their wives, for example, to engage in such behaviors. They have more debt, lower quality of interpersonal relationships, act in more ecologically destructive ways, adversive work and educational motivation, have lower personal and physical well-being. Um, and it conflicts with important self-regulatory goals or values, right? There's higher levels of ambivalence, reduced affective well-being, the repeated experience of unwanted desires intruding into consciousness and sticking around may lower one's life satisfaction via the self-attribution of low control and perceived helpless and mediating mechanism. So point is that we know through research, through data, that if you have poor desire control, I would just say poor control of yourself and your nafs, it can lead to a lot of problematic behaviors, right? Now, what are some benefits? Okay, now, unfortunately, the Western system, which is also like penetrating into countries like Pakistan and other Muslim countries, they don't want you to control your desires, right? Think about this. Like a new iPhone comes out every year. I usually control myself. Last year, I ended up buying the previous year version. I don't need a new iPhone. People don't need a new phone, but they want you to buy a new phone, right? It doesn't help them if you don't buy a new phone every year. So are are they going to tell you in the West, is the Western psychology going to tell you, hey, maybe you shouldn't buy the new phone? Absolutely not, right? Because it goes against the agenda of consumption. It goes against the agenda of capitalism, of materialism, which is what drives the Western economy. In the West, if some things become popular in the West, to be frank with you, you should always be wary of it. Always worry that why is it becoming popular? If something comes from the West, why is this so popular? Instead of jumping on board and engaging with it, be critical of it. I would say 9 out of 10 times the popularity exists because it feeds into capitalism. In the West, branding, advertisement, personal selling, packaging, display, all of them are maintained to tempt people and to promise them, to tell them about their enhanced identity, why this is more important for you. Why do you have to have this purse, right? You go into, I was at the airport and they had, no, sorry, I was at the mall here in Qatar, and they had these Hermes purses, right? Thousands and thousands of dollars. I went in and took a look. I couldn't tell the difference. Like, why is this so special? But they have to tell you that this is a brand, right? There's there's something about it that will impress people. That's a very nafsani way of engaging with something. Economists, politicians, playwrights, novelists have identified that economic and socialist systems that encourage materialistic human desires hold the most promise for maximizing material wealth and individual freedom. Notice how those two things are going together, because individual freedom leads to more materialism, right? I'll say it again, individual freedom leads to more materialism. In the West, through all of these liberal, ultra-liberal ideologies that we see in Pakistan or in Western countries, individualism, secularism, feminism, all of these are enhancing the person to think that they are worth something, that they have some inherent, not inherent, they have this value that the world owes them something, right? Whether or not they have done something in their life, but the world owes them something. And in order to then feed that identity, then they have to engage in materialism, right? I'm special, and the way I can show my specialty is if I have a really nice car, if I have a really good phone, if I have a really good purse, if I wear branded clothes, for example. And then there's this social comparison that happens, right? And what did the Prophet ﷺ say? When it comes to the matter of dunya, look at the people below you. When it comes to the matter of deen, look at the people above you. But we do the opposite. When it comes to the matter of dunya, we look at the people above us. Oh, look, this guy has a really nice car. This person has a really nice house. So therefore, I'm going to try to get that. I wish I had that too, right? Um, in Qatar, for example, there are certain places that you go and there's really big houses, nice cars and Rolls Royces and all sorts of things. And then there's some places you go, there's like really poor housing, poor people. A lot of them are either from Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. They're coming here to work and they're living in really poor conditions. If I drove in the big neighborhood every day, naturally I'm going to compare myself to those. But if I engage with those who are poor, this is why the Sunnah, right? The Prophet ﷺ was always engaging with those who are below him, right? Because that constant engagement is going to train me into appreciating what I have, because I'm looking at people that are always below me. And that's happening naturally. That's not a deliberate process. Sorry, my chai is getting cold, so I don't want to the person here made it for me. I don't want to not drink it and leave it out. The modern subjectivity, this is another quote that I like. Subjectivity produces a more subtle form of power that is perceived as freedom. Okay. To do this, individuals must first come to feel that they have a free will, agency, freedom to choose their lifestyle. This requires that people monitor their inner thoughts and desires in order to become the sorts of people they would like to be. This does not mean that they are really free agents, but it entails a felt agency. They have this feeling, they're told that you're free. There's no such thing as free thinking, by the way. People sometimes say, especially atheists, they'll say, "Oh, we're free thinkers." Anyone who has any knowledge in psychology, and especially those who are psychology students, should know that there's no such thing as free thinking. Right? All of my thoughts are motivated. Even if I sat and I said, okay, I'm going to sit and think about this process, that also is motivated by something that is happening in my, inside of me. Okay. Particular modern self-construction and self-presentation. In modernity, we have a choice of selves, but becoming a choosing self is not freedom, but a strategy of modern governance. Constraints on desire, no longer imposed by traditional institutions, are now embedded in the range of social lifestyles available for the choosing self. Now, this was written in the 80s, by the way. But look at right now. I mean, if you go to the APA convention, for example, American Psychological Association, this is like the main body of psychology in the world. You will see now things there that just kind of shock you to the core, right? I went, I think it was 2 years ago now, and they had this booth where they were teaching therapists and psychologists how to support open relationships, okay, non-monogamous relationships, having multiple partners. Why? Because again, that's what freedom is about, right? If you are married, you're no longer free, right? You're tied to one spouse. You're tied to that person that you're committed to. And that's not something that the Western mindset or postmodernism teaches us. Now, while this modern reflexivity ostensibly attends inner rather than outer perceptions of what others expect of us, it involves an internalized and thus even more effective acceptance of non-imposed social morals, right? And that's again how the Western control has been on the minds of individuals. Use their desires, use their need to be free, use their need to want to engage in pleasure to be able to control them. Because then how easy it is to control someone's mind through advertisement, social media. It's become so easy now. Our phones are listening to us constantly. So if you if you really talk about some things, if you really search some things, it will come up more and more in your feed, and that's how they control it. Okay, so what are the this is a bit of a side tangent here, but I do want to talk about this because it's really important. In the Western psychological model, um, people who have developed it through some sort of personal values, social projects, experiments, or political interests, right? So if, for example, I'm a psychologist and I'm a researcher, I'm a professor, and I want to engage in or I want to promote the idea of Islamic psychology, for example, or let's use a different example. Let's say I want to promote the idea of why it is it's a good idea for people to drink chai. Okay, let's just use a silly example just to get everyone's attention back. So if I want that and I do a study on the benefits of chai, and I design the study in a way that I want the outcome to support what I want. This is how most dissertations are done, right? People who are engaged in dissertation process, they don't come in. Ideally, they should come in with some research questions and aims, and then they should like say, okay, I want to see what the data shows. A lot of times people come in with some agenda and they want to do certain analyses because they want to see their hypotheses proven because that looks good, right? That gets published, that gets more attention. If you have 10 hypotheses and none of them are proven, I mean, you can't, it's hard to publish that data, right? And so that goes through that filter of people, what they want to engage in, what they're trying to promote. So I'll do a study that proves the benefits of chai, and then if it doesn't prove it, if the data shows the opposite, well, guess what? I'm not going to do anything with it. I'll probably put that in my shelf somewhere in my computer file, and I'll probably forget about it. Okay, I did a study, whatever, some interesting finding came about, but didn't happen. But if it shows that chai is good for you, then guess what? I'm going to now promote it. I'm going to send it for publication. I might, slice it up into several different publications and try to publish them. So I have a certain agenda that I want to promote. Journals who agree with my agenda, editors in chiefs or editorial boards who agree with my agenda, who also like chai. Hold on, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Okay, so journals who also are on board with the same agenda will take my paper and would want to publish it. Those in the media who also like drinking chai will take that story, that publication, and will make it accessible to the public. Those who are in power, right? Those who are in Congress and in Senate and whatnot, they will say, you know what, this is there's a study that came out that showed the benefits of chai, so therefore we're going to make this a policy. All government offices will now be served chai, right? So the things that are known to us through media, through publications, through research, are those things that have been intentionally promoted. Okay, this is the point I want to drive home. That a lot of times people get stuck on this idea of evidence-based practice. It's good to have evidence. I'm not saying don't do that, but don't get stuck on this idea because just because something has been published, something that has been mentioned in the media, something that has been put into a book or into a journal, does not mean that it is a fact. Okay. In fact, like you can even say, well, there's 10 studies that show the benefits of chai. I will ask the question, what about the 10 other studies that didn't show the benefits of chai, but that were never moved beyond the stage of maybe data collection or data analysis, and that's it. They were just kind of left there. Like, who knows about those studies? Does anyone know? So that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. Just because we see something in a textbook, in a journal, does not make it haqq, does not make it the truth. Okay. Now, from a spiritual religious perspective, I mean, all religions, all major world religions, all faiths have this notion of curbing desires. They all have this understanding that your desires are not meant to be pursued, that we're meant to inhibit their pursuit. Now, Islam doesn't just say curb the desire. Islam is not a religion of asceticism, monasticism, right? That, for example, in Christianity, if you become a priest, you can't get married, right? It's one of their like rules, because the idea is that if you're the one preaching about God and about Jesus, then you should be able to control your desires. Islam doesn't say that, because Islam recognizes that our nafs is part of who we are, and uh, pushing the nafs back all the time and not engaging with it in a healthy way is not going to be helpful, is not going to make us productive, make us a healthy Muslim in this world. In fact, it'll say that if you push too much, the nafs is going to fight back. This is why we saw in the Christian, in the United States, for example, a lot of these priests were implicated on what? On child molestation. We see the same problem, by the way, in some of our madaris as well, right? These problems exist. Why? Because we are not providing a healthy, acceptable Islamic way of engaging in our most basic innate desires, right? That's something that Islam recognizes. Our existence in this temporal world, our materialistic existence, it gives rises to these competing drives inside of us that, if they're left to themselves, right, much like the world that we live in, which is full of entropy, it would fall towards hedonism and self-destruction, right? So our job as humans, this is why drugs are haram, right? One of the reasons is because it takes you out of your own control, your aql. Our job is to have our aql always activated. The only time that it's not activated is if you're sleeping. Hence why the pen is lifted on the person if they're sleeping. If someone commits a murder in their sleep, they're actually sleeping, they in Islamic court, they wouldn't be charged with murder, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wouldn't count that against them because you're sleeping. But when you're not sleeping, you have to have your aql under control, and aql has to control your nafs, and so that your nafs does not go into anything that would be hedonistic or self-destructive, right? And we know that mental illness, right, is on a spectrum. So even like the functioning of the nafs is on a spectrum. Some people have a really good control of their nafs, right? Even those, they struggle from time to time because the state of the nafs changes. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's some people who have really poor control of their nafs, really poor impulse control. So a lot of the attention in the Sufi literature has been given to what? Tazkiyat al-nafs, mukhalafat al-nafs, mujahat al-nafs. We see these terms all the time. Basically, how do we purify ourselves? The Quran says, what? قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى وَذَكَرَ اسْمَ رَبِّهِ فَصَلَّى. Right? That the successful one is the one who has what? Who has purified it, purified the nafs, purified himself. Which, by the way, I don't want you to get stuck on terminology. Like some people say, well, is it talking about the nafs or is it talking about the ruh? It doesn't matter. What we know is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has used some of these terminology, nafs and ruh. What does it exactly mean? Are they different? Are they the same? It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we know that our nafs drives us, or nafs is that part of us, that element of us that if it left to its own whims and desires, it will bring us to the lowest possible thing. Like what does it say? لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ. You become the lowest of the low, right? If you go down towards that direction. Or in Surah Layl, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by the night and day. And then he says, فَأَمَّا مَنْ أَعْطَى وَاتَّقَى وَصَدَّقَ بِالْحُسْنَى فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْيُسْرَى. That whoever's doing good, that good path becomes easy for them. But then on the other hand, وَأَمَّا مَنْ بَخِلَ وَاسْتَغْنَى وَكَذَّبَ بِالْحُسْنَى فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْعُسْرَى. Whoever's engaging in evil, that path also what? Becomes easy for them. Allah makes that path easy for them. So naturally, if you don't control yourself, if you keep engaging in this, that becomes easier and easier. But if you begin to assert control, guess what? That also becomes easier and easier and easier. The nafs will fight back, but eventually it will come under your control. And what we're asked to do is have a balanced state, right? A state where our impulses, we recognize the impulses, we recognize the urges, but we're able to maintain them. We're able to engage in gratitude. Sorry, in fulfilling the desires, but at a later stage, right? It's not immediate gratification; it's delayed gratification. If it's not possible immediately, right? For example, intimacy. What did the Prophet ﷺ say? If any one of you has any kind of thoughts, you should do what? Come home and engage in intimacy. So if you have the ability to do so, you should fulfill that desire because you have a halal way of doing it. If you're married, but if not, if you're not married, for example, what do? You fast. Right? You're delaying that gratification. There's no way for you to immediately fulfill that desire. So ideally, because that's also taming our nafs. Okay, and that balance, right, is what brings about health according to the Islamic perspective. Sorry, one more sip. Okay, so from the Islamic tradition, we again in our model, the TIP model, we translate nafs as behavioral inclinations. Okay, and even though we are human beings who are born on a fitra, which is a positive, healthy state, which recognizes good, which is inclination towards good, it aspires towards being virtuous, righteous. We also have these competing impulses of our nafs. I mentioned Shah Waliullah Dahlavi, Imam Ghazali, all of these, Imam Suhrawardi, they all talk about this idea of that we have these competing desires inside of us, right? Imam Ghazali will say, like, and this is what's mentioned in the next point, that inside of us are, if you get a chance, you should read. It's a very small book, Kimya Sa'adat. It's translated in Urdu as well. It's originally written in Farsi, I believe. He mentions in the very beginning, like knowing yourself and why it's important to know yourself. And then he says, inside of you are qualities. Every human beings have certain qualities. Some of those qualities inside of us or characteristics are angelic. Some of them are satanic, and then some of them are animalistic. And then he categorized into two different categories: aggressive, predatory, and appetitive and pleasure seeking, right? Different terms that are used interchangeably throughout the Islamic literature. The nafs is not considered inherently evil, right? It's this state of it that could shift from being bad, like nafsul amara bisu, which most of you have heard this terminology. It could also be shifted or can shift itself into nafsul lawama, right? So nafsul lawama can happen automatically, where you have this, in Urdu we say zamir, right? Like you have this kind of a pushback in your conscious, like, hey, you shouldn't do this. Maybe this is bad for you. It's unhealthy for you. Or you can engage with it. You can bring in using your aql, thoughts and images that can also push back towards that behavior. And through that work that you engage with it, you purify it, you push back, you purify it, you train it again and again and again. Eventually, what happens is that tension becomes more peaceful. So if you read, if you get a chance, also you should read the beginning of Hujjatullah al-Baligha, right? This is Shah Waliullah Dahlavi's, and he talks about these states. So you have this high quwa shahwaniya and high quwa malakiya, and then low quwa shahwaniya, and they could be at either a state of tajadub, or they could be a state of like sukoon or peace. And what does that look like? So that tension can become more peaceful, and that peaceful and that itminan is what the nafs al-mutma'inna is, right? It's content with the decree of Allah. It's content with its tensions. It's content with its desires being there. It will fulfill it in the right way if it's possible. It would push back whenever it can. Okay, that's the path that we often are talk about. We talk about the nafs. I'll come back to this slide. Well, actually, let's read this quote and then we'll go back to the slide. So Al-Kindi says, nafs is honorable, effective. Its value is great. Its honor comes from its creator, as the light of the sun comes from the sun directly. Even though nafs has some negative faculties, still its essence is free from material. It is spiritual and holy. Sometimes negative feelings may urge man to do bad things, but nafs prevents them, like a cavalry who controls a wild horse with a leash. Right? So the nafs has that potential. And we all have heard these terminology, nafs al-amara mentioned in the Quran. This is in Surah Yusuf. Surah Yusuf is a very good example. Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, he was a prophet. Okay, prophets are guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We say prophets are masoom. But in the Quran, how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mention what happened to Yusuf alayhi salam? He says, وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرْأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّي. One of my favorite ayahs. He says, she approached him. This is a very beautiful, powerful woman, okay, who closes the doors and approaches Yusuf alayhi salam. And he would have approached her had he not been basically guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Think about that for a second, right? Allah is talking about his tendency to want to respond because it's a very natural thing, right? Your nafs, a man's nafs would want that, okay? Desires for that. So when she approached him, he would have approached, but he was guided by Allah. So that's where the nafs al-amara is mentioned, right? In the nafs al-amara bisu illa man rahima rabbi. That nafs al-amara is, it acts towards indulging, gratifying, and towards evil, except for those who have the rahmah of the Lord. And then nafsul lawama pushes back, like malama, we say in Urdu malamat, right? Is to push back, to kind of criticize, to say, hey, don't do this. This is bad for you. It's not good for you. Sometimes, by the way, that pushing back can become unhealthy as well, right? Sometimes like overactive nafsul lawama, in EFT, they call that like internal critic, right? It becomes very unhealthy. So it's important to like recognize, like, is this really pushing back something that is bad, or am I just being very overly negative with myself? In CBT, they call it automatic negative thoughts, right? That's also like could be overactive, unhealthy nafsul lawama. And as I mentioned before, nafsul mutma'inna is that which is content with the will of Allah. I want to mention one thing important here, which is important for us as Muslims and our patients who are also Muslims. The importance of engaging in sunnah, okay? Why is sunnah so important? Now, it's very interesting because sunnah is not fard, right? So, for example, if you go and you pray two rakah fajr, 4 rakah zuhr, 4 asr, 3 maghrib, 4 isha, that's it. You've done your job, right? That's the most basic thing required. As far as your salah is concerned, you're finished. But then there's sunnahs that exist there, right? So why do they exist? So this is where the nafs part comes in. Because what are sunnah? For example, it is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to drink the water and breathe in between. Take sips and breathe in between. Bismillah. So, I would take a breathe and then I would, Alhamdulillah. That's sunnah, right? I said Bismillah, I'm drinking with my right hand. I'm breathing in between. I said Alhamdulillah afterwards. I am sitting down and doing it. Let's say that if I was standing up and with my left hand and I took one sip, I didn't say Bismillah or Alhamdulillah, and I drank water. Did I commit a sin? No. It's not sinful to do that. I don't have to do the sunnah act. But what sunnah does is it tells us what to do, even though you have the freedom to not do it. Think of this. This is the engagement, and this is the training of the nafs, right? That I can drink with my left hand, but I'm consciously saying no, even though I have that freedom, I'm going to go against it. I'm going to drink with my right hand. I can drink it one sip, and standing, I said no, I'm going to do it the other way. I don't have to say Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, but I'm going to do it intentionally because I am pushing back towards this individual freedom that I have. We talked about this earlier, right? Desires and how individual freedom plays a big role. I don't want to be free. I would rather be the slave of Allah. I would rather be the follower of the Prophet ﷺ than to think that I'm free to do whatever I want, because that gives my nafs or me more control over my nafs and my desires. Okay, so that's why sunnah is very important. Why is fasting prescribed by the Prophet ﷺ to control the desire, especially sexual desires? Because what is fasting, right? Ramadan, something that you can do, something that's halal for you. You can eat, right? As long as it's rizq, halal, and tayyib, you're allowed to eat it. You can be intimate. You can drink water. But what you're doing is you're engaging in voluntary control of that which is allowed for you, which you can otherwise engage in. Now you're asked to not engage in it. That voluntary control of that which is allowed strengthens our ability to voluntary control and even involuntary control that which is not allowed. Okay, so if we pray sunnahs and that becomes our regular norm, we are less likely to miss fard. We might miss sunnah because that's where the bar is set, but we won't miss the fard. But if our basic is just fard, then there may come a time where we might miss a fard or two. We might say, oh yeah, I didn't pray. Oops, so bad, too bad. I didn't wake up for Fajr. And there's no like nothing that pushes back against us. That's why it's important to set the bar a little bit higher. That's why in our work as psychologists, we have to not only bring in the conversation about the nafs, not only assess the nafs, but engage with the client and how the bar could be set higher for us. Okay. Which, by the way, even if the client is not Muslim or they're not religious, the idea is still the same. It comes back to fulfilling your desires. That if someone engages in fulfillment of their desire, their jaiz desires, then it's easier for them to slip. But if they control their desires, in fact, if they go a level above, they push back against their desires, they engage in something that might be the opposite of their desires, that gives them even more control over their ability to control their nafs. Okay, so what are the attributes of nafs? A lot of the scholars use, animal like as an example, right? Camel, like this is Islamic Bal does the same thing, right? He says, "Nafsitu misle shutar khud parwarast, khud sarast, khud sawar, khud parast." That your nafs is like a camel. It's self-conceited, stubborn, rebellious, self-growing, egotistical, and self-governed. He mentions like four qualities of the nafs. Some scholars use the example of a dog, right? Example of a horse. These are animals, which, by the way, like look at a dog, for example. A well-trained dog is a very powerful tool. Police officers in Western countries have dogs because they're so well-trained. If they tell them to sit in place, they will sit there all day long, will not move, right? Some of those dogs are so well-trained. I was in high school. I remember we did a story on these training of these dogs. Some of them get trained in Germany, I think, that a police officer, he took keys from my teacher and he threw them in the field, and then the dog was in the car. Dog didn't even see where the keys went. Then he went and got the dog and he said something to the dog, and the dog went and sniffed and found the keys and brought them back. We have dogs that guide blind people. You have dogs at the airport that can sniff drugs, right? So they can tell the guard that this person might be carrying drugs in it. That's a trained dog. But then you have untrained dogs, that the wild dogs who might be on the street, and they just come to someone and just start bite them for no reason. They might be attacking someone for no reason, out of control. There's no control at all on their behaviors. That's why these examples are used in the Islamic literature, right? That if you don't control your nafs will make you like that animal that is out of control, that does whatever it wants. But if you train it, it could be a very healthy tool for you. It becomes the animal that then you can ride towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a really interesting diagram. See if I can find it somewhere. But that diagram is from one of the books I'm sure growing up, some of the people who are a bit older might remember, like Mullah Nasruddin. Like these are these stories of Mullah Nasruddin and his donkey, right? And there's a diagram. It's called the Mujaddidi path. It's very interesting. It says that the individual, it shows Mullah Nasruddin first. He's in the market and he's looking, and he has no idea his nafs exists, the donkey exists. Then he finds the steps, the footsteps of the donkey. So then he finds the donkey, and then he pushes against the donkey. So he wants the donkey to to come to him, but the donkey pushes back. And then eventually he comes to a point where the donkey finally says, okay, fine, I'll go with you. And then they show Mullah Nasruddin, and he's riding the donkey now. Okay. So, and then eventually the donkey kind of fades away, right? The point of that whole diagram, or that whole story, it's called the Mujaddidi path, comes from Mujaddid al-Fisani, is that an individual can be in a state where they're not even aware of their nafs. They have no idea how the nafs is behaving and how it's acting. Then if they start to push back, the nafs will fight back. And then eventually the nafs will cave in. The nafs will be under their control. And then they can use the nafs to then ride to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There comes a state where the person and the nafs become one. Like they're no longer at this, the state of tension with one another. So to initiate this journey towards training the nafs, and reaching the highest status, the scholars assert that man has to undergo hardships, patience, perseverance, giving up the bodily desires like hunger, sleep, lust, This will then increase self-control, controls the impulses through force and through self-discipline. Again, this is even Allama Iqbal talks about this, right? There's certain stages that you have to go through in order to be able to then control the nafs, for example. And certain terminology that's important to recognize, which is what's even used in modern psychology, for example, behavioral reformation. Right? This is to engage in pro-social behaviors. In the beginning, it might require some exertion, but what are you doing? You're training the nafs to develop this tendency to become a natural inclination, right? So, for example, um, if you're the type of person that is considered to be rude to other people, right? Then what you do is you make an intention to go and you push yourself to go and be nice to someone. In the beginning, it's going to sound very unnatural. Oh, yeah, I don't know if I can do that. If you're a person who has public speaking problems, right? A lot of times the nafs wants to avoid. We see this in anxiety, social anxiety, right? People are avoidant. People with social anxiety, what do you have to do? You have to push them to not only engage in the things that they're doing, but to do something more, right? Because if you do the opposite, especially if it's a positive opposite, then it's likely to extinguish that behavior. It's likely to reform that behavior. Internal regulation, persistent behavioral modification, and continued behavioral performance of the desired behavior will what? Automate, will habituate, and it will start to soften and challenge the beliefs that have maintained those behaviors in the first place, right? So the key here is continued behavioral performance. This is not a one-time thing, right? The nafs in our Islamic understanding, the nafs can change the state multiple times a day. A person can have their nafs under control 1 second, and the next second it's out of control. There's a famous story of a Sufi sheikh who was walking in the street with his murids, and he saw this person who was drinking alcohol or something, and he was in a very poor state. And then the person asked the sheikh, he said, Ya sheikh, can I be in your state? Can I, like you, mashallah, are knowledgeable, wali of Allah, can I be like you? And then the sheikh says, yes, in the blink of an eye, if Allah wills it. And then he asked the next question, he said, can you be like me? And he says, yes, in the blink of an eye, if Allah wills it. Meaning the nafs can shift and bring the person to a higher state or bring them to a lower state. And this struggle happens constantly. Like nafsul mutma'inna, some scholars say this is a state that happens in the akhirah. In dunya, there's always going to be this tension that exists. But that tension has to be part of our work, has to be part of our daily life, our journey as individuals, as well as psychologists. We know reciprocal inhibition is a process of what? Supplementing an alternative behavior that inhibits the undesirable behavior on the account of its incompatibility when done simultaneously, right? I mentioned earlier, like if there's someone that you don't like, then you go and say salam to them, you go and smile to them. That inhibits like the hatred that you might have for them, because you're doing something, you're pairing something good with something bad. You're facing your enemy, but you're also doing what? You're saying salam to them, you're smiling at them. Okay, the nafs requires us to embrace discomfort. That discomfort we know through exposure therapy, that when we engage in exposure therapy for OCD, PTSD, whatever it is that we treat, it pushes back. It's discomfort, it's uncomfortable, very painful for the individual. But that's what's required to be able to train and have more control over the nafs. And then the idea is that you self-monitor, self-evaluate, self-reprimand, self-exert, mu'aqaba, mu'ataba, mujahada, muhasaba. These are terms that Imam Ghazali uses, right? In order to go down this path and in order to have this life of a struggling believer. This is a constant struggle that continues on. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I've spoken a lot, and I will open up to any kind of questions that we might have. I know Zohar here is in about 20 minutes, so inshallah, I'd like to go pray Zohar at time. So we have about 20 minutes for any questions, any feedback, any comments. I appreciate you listening. I don't know if anyone's still listening or not. I hope, because I'm just looking at blank screen. But I appreciate any questions or any comments that you might have at this point. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fahad Khan, for such an engaging and such a insightful session. We do have a lot of questions here because we have an audience with us, and I will be asking you questions. All of those I've written down. So one question we have is that what indicators do you believe help differentiate between nafs driven desires and trauma driven addictive behavior?
Yeah. So I don't think there's a differentiation between the two. I think when someone has to, okay, so let me take a step back for a second, right? Um, Shaitan and our nafs can have more influence on our behaviors if we're psychologically or physically vulnerable. So, what do I mean by that? Let's look at physical vulnerability for a second. If, for example, I have eaten unhealthy all my life and my body has sugar cravings, then physically I'm weak. So, if my nafs asks me, or I start to think of like sugary things or cakes or whatever, then I'm more likely to engage in it. There's some people who are born, like OCD, for example, is a good example. Some people are born with this biological weakness, you might say. So then the shaitan can do more waswas on them. They engage in these behaviors again and again. PTSD, through the trauma, it makes the person weak in a certain way. It doesn't have to be a weakness for life, right? You can obviously grow from it. Some people have post-traumatic growth, right? But the point is that that weakness then allows the nafs to engage in that behavior more, whether it's avoidance, which is what we see in PTSD, or sometimes in self gratification. People who are traumatized will engage in some kind of gratifying behaviors. They might engage in, like we see this in borderline personality, this power struggle. Narcissistic behaviors comes oftentimes at the core of it is some kind of childhood trauma as well. So those are driven by the nafs. So there's no difference between, I would say, PTSD versus nafs. At the core of it is nafs. The only difference here would be as someone who doesn't have PTSD can have an out of control nafs. Someone who has PTSD is psychologically vulnerable, psychologically weak through because of their trauma. And this is not a judgment call, by the way. I'm not saying they're weak. Like, obviously, ultimately, it's up to Allah. Allah is the one who judges. You know, someone who has had complex trauma and drinks alcohol, I'm sure Allah will judge them differently than someone who does not have complex trauma and drinks alcohol. It's a habit, or they just don't want to control their nafs. There's a difference between the two, right? So I'm not passing a judgment, but the reality is there is a psychological weakness that then allows the nafs to have more control over their behaviors.
Thank you so much. I'm sure the difference is now clear to everybody. We'll move on to our next question. Someone here asked, "What trauma patterns do you commonly observe in Muslim clients?" I'm sure you must have Muslim clients as well. So, what patterns do you observe when they're struggling with addiction?
Okay, so the two terms that I use are trauma and addiction. So I think if we just kind of took a step back and looked at perhaps maybe even anxiety-based patterns, I think nafsani patterns, there's certain categories of nafsani patterns. For example, someone can have nafsani behaviors that are safety behaviors, right? Excessive checking, reassurance seeking, controlling the environment or relationships, like in borderline that we see, avoiding risks or new experiences because of fear of harm. You want to be safe. You over prepare, perfectionistic rituals. That's a safety behavior. Wanting, again, reassurance or even approval or validation from someone. Over preparing, carrying objects of comfort, right? That's a safety behavior as well because it makes you feel comfortable. That's a safety seeking behavior within the nafs category. Then there's like pain and pleasure behaviors. So eating, drinking, sexual desires, nail biting, self-harm is a pain or pleasure nafsani behavior. Then there's avoidance behaviors like social avoidance, isolation, procrastination. You're avoiding the responsibilities, skipping responsibilities altogether, school, work, not going to a family party, for example, avoiding conversations or conflicts. Emotional numbing or shutting down is also an avoidant behavior. Avoiding religious practices, for example. Then there's behavioral addictions. This is another nafsani category. Gambling, social media, pornography, shopping. Then there's compulsive behaviors. We see this in OCD, for example, but these are behaviors that most people have. Checking things, whether you're checking your phone, your messages again and again, cleaning compulsively, ordering, counting, hoarding. There's the mental rituals. Sometimes people engage in compulsive thought patterns. Again, reassurance seeking can also be considered compulsive behavior here as well. And then there's overcompensatory behaviors as well, excessive control, micromanaging, people pleasing, right? You're compensating for something. This oftentimes we see with trauma, for example, dominance, grandiosity. These are type of behaviors. So there's a whole ways and categories on how nafs can, influence. We wrote a book on anxiety, generalized anxiety. It's a workbook. Actually, I have it here. This is the one. This has been released a while ago, and it's the Islamic workbook on managing anxiety. And in this, because with anxiety we see the nafsani behaviors very common, like avoidance and all these things, for example. So we go over, when we talk about the treatment, we first go over what is anxiety, then we talk about cognitive treatments, treating the aql, then we go into treating the nafs. And in those we talk about all these behaviors, and what's the plan to like overcome these.
Thank you for answering that. We have another question here. Somebody here asked us, how is it that you're able to balance accountability and compassion when treating addictive behaviors?
Mm. Yeah, so I think this is where a good psychologist would be able to sense this, right? So uh, sometimes some healthy habits can become unhealthy. I'll give you another example: shame. Shame could be healthy, shame could be unhealthy. Healthy shame is one that protects you, right? Like, for example, we say like ghaira is healthy shame, you can say, right? Haya is like a part of healthy shame. But then there's unhealthy shame, excessive shame, too much internalized shame, the debilitating shame. I had a client who had a pornography addiction, and he once described this process that he would go through. Like he would be engaging, he had these triggers, then he had this shame that would come in and say, I shouldn't do this. But then he would become numb. Then he would engage in the behavior, and then while he's engaging in the behavior, now unhealthy shame kicks in. Oh, you're doomed. What's the point? And so then the behavior would continue. So identifying healthy and unhealthy is really important here. Muhasaba, self accountability, can be healthy, right? Like, it's not a very like easy divide between the two. There's obviously things that overlap here, right? So like checking in with yourself. Okay, why did I do that? I shouldn't have done that. Oh man, that's not a good idea. Why did I do that? I need to like stop this behavior. I need to find out what's happening, what happened before it, versus like, oh, you're a horrible person, you're doomed, things are never going to get better, what's the point? And then you can't even like, get anything done because all day you keep thinking about, so this over accountability, right? For us as Muslims, for example, if you engage in a sinful behavior, we say astaghfirullah, we do tawbah, and we move on, right? We have this intention that we won't do it again, but we move on. We don't get stuck in it. We don't like, ruminate on it for days and days and days. That's not healthy tawbah, right? Healthy tawbah is one that you like Musa alayhi salam, when he punches the guy and the guy dies, he immediately says, this is from the actions of shaitan, and he seeks refuge from it, and he moves on, right? Like, that's the type of the attitude that we need to have, instead of being overly critical of us and then not being able to move on.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Fahad, for answering that. The next question we have, and since you did elaborate on accountability really well, how do you think community stigma impacts recovery, and how us as clinicians, how can we reduce that, especially in this South Asian culture?
Yeah. So, okay. So stigma towards, if you're talking about mental treatment, obviously that's something that is oftentimes not healthy. Now, I just want to say one thing though. I think like the word stigma gets thrown out a lot, and it's true, it exists. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but in the West, and just between us here who are professionals and students and faculty here, not everyone needs therapy, right? I think the idea that everyone needs to go to see a therapist, everyone needs a psychologist, is not necessary. Yes, everyone needs to be aware, and we need to kind of work on ourselves. Sometimes we need a friend, sometimes we need a teacher, a sheikh, sometimes it could be your parent, your brother. And then if things get really out of hand, then you need a mental health provider. So, yes, stigma is bad, but then there's the other extreme here as well, right? So, stigma towards mental health and treatment is bad. Stigma towards like some of these behaviors is bad too. Like in our society, for example, we look down upon someone who drinks alcohol. We look down upon someone who engages in cocaine use or heroin use. But then when someone is like compulsively shopping, someone is on social media, someone is doing, all of us have behaviors. I was in Islamabad, there's a rehab clinic. Um, and I was visiting it, and there were these patients there, and one of them mentioned, he said, I feel really shamed. People really say that you're a bad person for having this addiction. And I told him, I said, all of us have addiction, right? Most of us are addicted to our phones. Like, we can't leave our phones, and if we don't look at our phones every hour, then we have this tension inside of us and this like state of anxiety that's indicative of addiction. So all of us have the addiction, and looking down upon someone because, and it's easier for us to say, oh, this person is bad, I'm okay, I don't have any problem, but this guy, he's the bad one. People say this in our society all the time. हमारी family, हमारे तरीका कितना अच्छा है, ये इन लोगों का इनका खाना भी अच्छा नहीं है, जिस तरह ये काम करते हैं, like overcritical of what other people do is a normal human tendency. So I think recognizing that is important. And as psychologists, we have to be able to talk about these things and mention to people, yes, sometimes some of these things, like for example, looking bad towards drug use has a preventative lens, right? So it's not entirely a bad thing. But if we're going to look bad at drug use, we also have to look bad at telephone use, right? The same person, the same mother, for example, who will criticize the daughter on using TikTok, will be sitting and watching dramas all day long. It's the same thing. Like, the problem is still the same, right? So why is it okay for her to watch dramas, 3-4 hours a day, but it's bad for the daughter to look at TikTok? Both of those behaviors have to be accounted for.
Thank you, Dr. Fahad. That brings me to my next question, actually, because you did mention that sometimes you need a spiritual mentor. How is it that we can involve imams or spiritual mentors in a coordinated treatment plan? Is there a way that that can happen?
Absolutely. So we did this in America. Khalil Center, the reason that we were successful, and we have been, alhamdulillah, successful, it's the largest provider of Muslim mental health in the West, probably, is because we were able to engage with the imams. We have to recognize there's a problem that exists especially in Pakistan and that part of the world. And I know why it exists too. My father was an imam. And one of the things that we see, which is not seen amongst like the Turkish or Arab population, is that we treat our imams like they're like worthless. They're just like not of value. And that's a thing that has been instilled onto us by the British. It's actually a colonial kind of a psychological warfare. At the time of colonialism, the imams had very similar status to those who sweep the streets, for example, right? Why? Because they're just like imam, there's like Molvi, so many people use like mullah, Molvi, log hain. Like that type of mentality is very unhealthy. What we have to do is we have to recognize imams and scholars, they have their place in society that's very important, necessary, and they have their knowledge that's very important. We have our knowledge. If we give them their respect, they will give us our respect, right? So recognizing my boundary, I don't come in my sessions and say this is halal, this is haram. That's not my area of expertise. Similarly, an imam and a scholar cannot tell a person, mental illness doesn't exist, depression is not real, right? So if we respect their boundaries, they will respect our boundaries. In Chicago, I will give you an example. We worked with the imams and on the importance of premarital counseling, right? Because the divorce rate is high, and so having people some counseling, 3-4 sessions, some kind of coaching before marriage, it can prevent divorce rate up to like 17%. There was some study on this amongst Muslims. So there are scholars and there are imams in Chicago that do not do nikah until the couple has done premarital. So we at Khalil Center, sometimes we get a call in the middle of the night and someone says, oh, my Maulvi Sahib won't do the nikah and it's tomorrow, and they're saying you have to do premarital. And what do I do right now? So then I say, okay, like, why don't we meet for a little bit, or we will maybe schedule one session and you have to make sure you commit to coming in. Imagine that kind of respect happened after we respected them and their authority, right? We engaged with them. Okay, if we have a question, we bring them into. If it's a religious-based discussion, we bring them in. We tell our clients to have a healthy relationship with their scholars, their imams, their shuyukh. That mutual respect is what's going to bring us. Unfortunately, the more educated people, especially from a Western approach, they have this mindset that my knowledge is superior. This Maulvi doesn't know anything, right? And my job is to push him out to the side, and he's going to mess up my treatment. That's not the case. And the Molvi also has the same mindset. If you go to madrasa, I studied in Atak, in Fatehjang, and I remember one time I was writing my name and my Quran in English, and one of the students said, "Oh, no, no, don't let the Qari Sahib see this, because this is the language of kuffar, right? So they don't like English. Write it in Urdu." So the point is that they also have extreme understanding of knowledge, education, science. In Islam, there's no divide between secular and sacred education. All of this is knowledge. Whether you're studying the Quran or you're studying a biology book, this is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to work towards bridging that gap. I think you're muted. I don't know if you're talking or not.
How would continue getting treatment, or how a relapse could be prevented. How do you think that somebody who's struggling with continuous relapses, repeated relapses, what would be your therapeutic strategy in that case?
Yeah, so first is just empathy towards the relapse process. A journey towards recovery is not a straight line, right? A lot of times you make a lot of improvement and then there's a relapse. The key for me is recognizing two things. So let's look at an example of someone who is addicted to pornography. Let's say the person looks at pornography every single day for 2 hours. Okay. And I've seen worse cases than that, but let's just take that as an example. And then you kind of work on it, and then they maybe go 1 or 2 days without pornography, and then they relapse. Okay, so now they've made progress. They've gone 2 days without pornography. Instead of every day, they've gone 2 days without it. Or you see that with time, even though they're relapsing, instead of looking at it for 2 hours, they're looking at it for 1 hour, 20 minutes. That's progress, right? In our mind, there's relapse because, yes, they're still looking at pornography, but it's not the same as it was before. So we have to appreciate that behavior. We have to, at least through praise, we have to tell that person, hey, you're doing a good job. Keep it up. Look at where you were before. Look at where you are now. And even if you go and then you relapse to like having one day, sometimes people, it happens. Like in behaviorism, they talk about this, right? Like you have this extinguished behavior and then all of a sudden it just emerges back. So you might have complete control, and then one day the person does 3 or 4 hours of pornography. Okay, that's okay. It happened. You went all these days without it. Now let's come back and let's continue down this path. No one in this dunya is free of sinning, free of problematic behaviors. Every one of us have problematic behaviors. The ones who are struggling and going down this path with that empathy, that person is better. We know this from a hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala likes those who sin. And if we didn't sin, then he would replace us with those who did sin. Because he's at tawwab, he constantly turns back. He's ghaffar, he constantly forgives. Right? And our job is to continue to go back to him. If we go back to him, he comes back to us. That's the mindset we have to have, not of like this fatalistic thing that, you relapse and then you're doomed. Now things aren't going to get better, or bring on unhealthy shame that you did this, you're hopeless, forget about it. There's no hope for you. So I'm sorry, but if it's okay, I'd like to go pray Zohar, if that's okay with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Fahad. You explained everything really well, and would hate to take more of your time, especially since you mentioned you have it's Zohar prayer time. And I would also like to thank our head of department, Dr. Aruj, and Dr. Anam Rabani as well for providing us with this opportunity. And I think today's session would really help us integrate Islamic psychology into therapy better. And thank you so much once again. I truly appreciate your time. Take care and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much for the time and the honor that you've given me. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to reach out. My email address is on Khalil Center's website. Also, if you go to the university's website, it's on there. And I can answer any questions or any feedback too. Inshallah, I appreciate that. Assalamu alaikum.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, and Allah Hafiz.